Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes, Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby, Part 5, Chapter 14 to 15. Chapter 14, wherein are inserted the despairing verses of the dead shepherd, together with other incidents not looked for. The Lay of Chrysostom. Since thou dost in thy cruelty desire the ruthless rigour of thy tyranny, from tongue to tongue, from land to land proclaimed, the very hell will I constrain to lend this stricken breast of mine deep notes of woe, to serve my need of fitting utterance. And as I strive to body forth the tale of all I suffer, all that thou hast done, forth shall the dread voice roll, and bear along shreds from my vitals torn for greater pain. Then listen, not to dulcet harmony, but to a discord wrung by mad despair out of this bosom's depths of bitterness, to ease my heart and plant a sting in thine. The lion's roar, the fierce wolf's savage howl, the horrid hissing of the scaly snake, the awesome cries of monsters yet unnamed, the crow's ill-boding croak, the hollow moan of wild winds wrestling with the restless sea, the wrathful bellow of the vanquished bull, the plaintive sobbing of the widowed dove, the envied owl's sad note, the wail of woe that rises from the dreary choir of hell, commingled in one sound, confusing sense, let all these come to aid my soul's complaint, for pain like mine demands new modes of song. No echoes of that discord shall be heard where Father Tagus rolls, or on the banks of allard-bordered Betis to the rocks, or in deep caverns shall my plaint be told. And by a lifeless tongue in living words, or in dark valleys or on lonely shores, where neither foot of man nor sunbeam falls, or in among the poison-breathing swarms of monsters nourished by the sluggish Nile, for though it be to solitudes remote, the hoarse vague echoes of my sorrows sound thy matchless cruelty, my dismal fate shall carry them to all the spacious world. Disdain hath power to kill, and patience dies, slain by suspicion, be it false or true. And deadly is the force of jealousy. Long absence makes of life a dreary void. No hope or happiness can give repose to him that ever fears to be forgot, and death inevitable waits in hall. But I, by some strange miracle, live on, a prey to absence, jealousy, disdain, racked by suspicion as by certainty, forgotten, left to feed my flame alone. And while I suffer thus, there comes no ray of hope to gladden me athwart the gloom. Nor do I look for it in my despair, but rather clinging to a cureless woe, all hope do I abjure for evermore. Can there be hope where fear is? Were it well, when far more certain are the grounds of fear? Ought I to shut mine eyes to jealousy, if through 1,000 heart wounds it appears? Who would not give free access to distrust, seeing disdain unveiled, and bitter change, all his suspicions turned to certainties, and the fair truth transformed into a lie? O thou fierce tyrant of the realms of love! O jealousy, put chains upon these hands, and bind me with thy strongest cord, disdain. But woe is me, triumphant over all. My sufferings drown the memory of you. And now I die. And since there is no hope of happiness for me in life or death, still to my fantasy I'll fondly cling. I'll say that he is wise who loveth well, and that the soul most free is that most bound in thraldom to the ancient tyrant love. I'll say that she who is mine enemy in that fair body hath as fair a mind, and that her coldness is but my desert, and that by virtue of the pain he sends, love rules his kingdom with a gentle sway. Thus self-deluding, and in bondage sore, and wearing out the wretched shred of life to which I am reduced by her disdain, I'll give this soul and body to the winds, all hopeless of a crown of bliss in store. Thou, whose injustice hath supplied the cause that makes me quit the weary life I loathe, as by this wounded bosom thou canst see, how willingly thy victim I become. Let not my death, if haply worth a tear, cloud the clear heaven that dwells in thy bright eyes. I would not have thee expiate in aught the crime of having made my heart thy prey, but rather let thy laughter gaily ring, and prove my death to be thy festival. Fool that I am to bid thee, well I know thy glory gains by my untimely end. And now it is the time from hell's abyss, come thirsting Tantalus, come Sisyphus, heaving the cruel stone, come Tydeus with vulture and with wheel Ixion come, and come the sisters of the ceaseless toil, and all into this breast transfer their pains, and, if such tribute to despair be due, chant in their deepest tones a doleful dirge over a corse unworthy of a shroud. Let the three-headed guardian of the gate, and all the monstrous progeny of hell, the doleful concert join. A lover dead, methinks, can have no fitter obsequies. Lay of despair, grieve not when thou art gone forth from this sorrowing heart. My misery brings fortune to the cause that gave thee birth. Then banish sadness even in the tomb. The lay of Chrysostom met with the approbation of the listeners, though the reader said it did not seem to him to agree with what he had heard of Marcella's reserve and propriety, for Chrysostom complained in it of jealousy, suspicion, and absence, all to the prejudice of the good name and fame of Marcella, to which Ambrosio replied, as one who knew well his friend's most secret thoughts, Señor, to remove that doubt, I should tell you that when the unhappy man wrote this lay, he was away from Marcella, from whom he had voluntarily separated himself, to try if absence would act with him as it is wont, and as everything distresses and every fear haunts the banished lover, so imaginary jealousies and suspicions, dreaded as if they were true, tormented Chrysostom, and thus the truth of what report declares of the virtue of Marcella remains unshaken, and with her envy itself should not and cannot find any fault, save that of being cruel, somewhat haughty, and very scornful. That is true, said Vivaldo, and as he was about to read another paper of those he had preserved from the fire, he was stopped by a marvellous vision, for such it seemed, that unexpectedly presented itself to their eyes. For on the summit of the rock where they were digging the grave, there appeared the shepherdess Marcella, so beautiful that her beauty exceeded its reputation. Those who had never till then beheld her gazed upon her in wonder and silence, and those who were accustomed to see her were not less amazed than those who had never seen her before. But the instant Ambrosio saw her, he addressed her with manifest indignation. "Art thou come by chance, cruel basilisk of these mountains, to see if in thy presence blood will flow from the wounds of this wretched being thy cruelty has robbed of life? Or is it to exult over the cruel work of thy humours that thou art come? Or like another pitiless Nero, to look down from that height upon the ruin of his Rome in embers? Or in thy arrogance to trample on this ill-fated corpse, as the ungrateful daughter trampled on her father Tarquin's? Tell us quickly for what thou art come, or what it is thou wouldst have. For, as I know the thoughts of Chrysostom never fail to obey thee in life, I will make all these who call themselves his friends obey thee, though he be dead." "I come not, Ambrosia, for any of the purposes thou hast named," replied Marcella, "but to defend myself and to prove how unreasonable are all those who blame me for their sorrow and for Chrysostom's death. And therefore I ask all of you that are here to give me your attention, for will not take much time or many words to bring the truth home to persons of sense. Heaven has made me, so you say, beautiful, and so much so that in spite of yourselves my beauty leads you to love me. And for the love you show me, you say, and even urge, that I am bound to love you. By that natural understanding which God has given me, I know that everything beautiful attracts love, but I cannot see how, by reason of being loved, that which is loved for its beauty is bound to love that which loves it. Besides, it may happen that the lover of that which is beautiful may be ugly, and ugliness being detestable, it is very absurd to say, I love thee because thou art beautiful. Thou must love me though I be ugly. But supposing the beauty equal on both sides, it does not follow that the inclinations must be therefore alike. For it is not every beauty that excites love, some but pleasing the eye without winning the affection. And if every sort of beauty excited love and won the heart, the will would wander vaguely to and fro, unable to make choice of any. For as there is an infinity of beautiful objects, there must be an infinity of inclinations. And true love, I have heard it said, is indivisible, and must be voluntary and not compelled. If this be so, as I believe it to be, why do you desire me to bend my will by force? For no other reason but that you say you love me. Nay, tell me, had heaven made me ugly, as it has made me beautiful, could I with justice complain of you for not loving me? Moreover, you must remember that the beauty I possess was no choice of mine, for, be it what it may, heaven of its bounty gave it me without my asking or choosing it. And as the viper, though it kills with it, does not deserve to be blamed for the poison it carries, as it is a gift of nature, neither do I deserve reproach for being beautiful. For beauty in a modest woman is like fire at a distance or a sharp sword. The one does not burn, the other does not cut. Those who do not come too near. Honor and virtue are the ornaments of the mind, without which the body, though it be so, has no right to pass for beautiful. But if modesty is one of the virtues that specially lend a grace and charm to mind and body, why should she who is loved for her beauty part with it to gratify one who for his pleasure alone strives with all his might and energy to rob her of it. I was born free, and that I might live in freedom, I chose the solitude of the fields. In the trees of the mountains I find society. The clear waters of the brooks are my mirrors, and to the trees and waters I make known my thoughts and charms. I am a fire afar off, a sword laid aside. Those whom I have inspired with love by letting them see me, I have by words undeceived. And if their longings live on hope, and I have given none to Chrysostom or to any other, it cannot justly be said that the death of any is my doing, for it was rather his own obstinacy than my cruelty that killed him. And if it be made a charge against me that his wishes were honourable, and that therefore I was bound to yield to them, I answer that when on this very spot where now his grave is made, he declared to me his purity of purpose, I told him that mine was to live in perpetual solitude, and that the earth alone should enjoy the fruits of my retirement and the spoils of my beauty. And if, after this open avowal, he chose to persist against hope and steer against the wind, what wonder is it that he should sink in the depths of his infatuation? If I had encouraged him, I should be false. If I had gratified him, I should have acted against my own better resolution and purpose. He was persistent in spite of warning. He despaired without being hated. But think you now, if it be reasonable that his suffering should be laid to my charge? Let him who has been deceived complain. Let him give way to despair, whose encouraged hopes have proved vain. Let him flatter himself, whom I shall entice. Let him boast, whom I shall receive. But let not him call me cruel, or homicide, to whom I make no promise, upon whom I practice no deception, whom I neither entice nor receive. It has not been so far the will of heaven that I should love by fate, and to expect me to love by choice is idle. Let this general declaration serve for each of my suitors on his own account, and let it be understood from this time forth that if anyone dies for me, it is not of jealousy or misery he dies, for she who loves no one can give no cause for jealousy to any, and candour is not to be confounded with scorn. Let him who calls me wild beast and basilisk leave me alone as something noxious and evil. Let him who calls me ungrateful withhold his service. Who calls me wayward, seek not my acquaintance. Who calls me cruel, pursue me not. For this wild beast, this basilisk, this ungrateful, cruel, wayward being has no kind of desire to seek, serve, know, or follow them. If Chrysostom's impatience and violent passion killed him, why should my modest behaviour and circumspection be blamed? If I preserve my purity in the society of the trees, why should he who would have me preserve it among men seek to rob me of it? I have, as you know, wealth of my own, and I covet not that of others. My taste is for freedom, and I have no relish for constraint. I neither love nor hate anyone. I do not deceive this one or court that, or trifle with one or play with another. The modest converse of the shepherd girls of these hamlets and the care of my goats are my recreations. My desires are bounded by these mountains, and if they ever wander hence, it is to contemplate the beauty of the heavens, steps by which the soul travels to its primeval abode. With these words, and not waiting to hear a reply, she turned and passed into the thickest part of a wood that was hard by, leaving all who were there lost in admiration as much of her good sense as of her beauty. Some, those wounded by the irresistible shafts launched by her bright eyes, made as though they would follow her, heedless of the frank declaration they had heard, seeing which, and deeming this a fitting occasion for the exercise of his chivalry in aid of distressed damsels, Don Quixote, laying his hand on the hilt of his sword, exclaimed in a loud and distinct voice, "Let no one, whatever his rank or condition, dare to follow the beautiful Marcella, under pain of incurring my fierce indignation. She has shown by clear and satisfactory arguments that little or no fault is to be found with her for the death of Chrysostom, and also how far she is from yielding to the wishes of any of her lovers, for which reason, instead of being followed and persecuted, she should in justice be honoured and esteemed by all the good people of the world, for she shows that she is the only woman in it that holds to such a virtuous resolution." Whether it was because of the threats of Don Quixote, or because Ambrosio told them to fulfill their duty to their good friend, none of the shepherds moved or stirred from the spot until, having finished the grave and burned Chrysostom's papers, they laid his body in it, not without many tears from those who stood by. They closed the grave with a heavy stone until a slab was ready, which Ambrosio said he meant to have prepared, with an epitaph which was to be to this effect: "Beneath the stone before your eyes the body of a lover lies. In life he was a shepherd swain, in death a victim to disdain. Ungrateful, cruel, coy, and fair was she that drove him to despair, and love hath made her his ally, for spreading wide his tyranny." They then strewed upon the grave a profusion of flowers and branches, and all expressing their condolence with his friend Ambrosio, took their Vivaldo, and his companion did the same, and Don Quixote bade farewell to his hosts and to the travellers, who pressed him to come with them to Seville, as being such a convenient place for finding adventures, for they presented themselves in every street and round every corner oftener than anywhere else. Don Quixote thanked them for their advice and for the disposition they showed to do him a favour, and said that for the present he would not and must not go to Seville until he had cleared all these mountains of highwaymen and robbers, of whom report said they were full. Seeing his good intention, the travellers were unwilling to press him further, and once more bidding him farewell, they left him and pursued their journey, in the course of which they did not fail to discuss the story of Marcella and Chrysostom, as well as the madness of Don Quixote. He, on his part, resolved to go in quest of the shepherdess Marcella, and make offer to her of all the service he could render her. But things did not fall out with him as he expected, according to what is related in the course of this veracious history, of which the second part ends here. Chapter 15, in which is related the unfortunate adventure that Don Quixote fell in with when he fell out with certain heartless Yanguesans. The sage Cide Hamete Benengele relates that as soon as Don Quixote took leave of his hosts and all who had been present at the burial of Chrysostom, he and his squire passed into the same wood which they had seen the shepherdess Marcella enter, and after having wandered for more than 2 hours in all directions in search of her without finding her, they came to a halt in a glade covered with tender grass, besides which ran a pleasant cool stream that invited and compelled them to pass there the hours of the noontide heat, which by this time was beginning to come on oppressively. Don Quixote and Sancho dismounted, and turning Rocinante and the ass loose to feed on the grass that there was there in abundance, they ransacked the alforjas, and without any ceremony, very peacefully and sociably, master and man made their repast on what they found in them. Sancho had not thought it worth while to hobble Rocinante, feeling sure from what he knew of his staidness and freedom from incontinence that all the mares in the Cordova pastures would not lead him into an impropriety. Chance, however, and the devil, who is not always asleep, so ordained it that feeding in this valley there was a drove of Galician ponies belonging to certain Yanguesan carriers, whose way it is to take their midday rest with their teams in places and spots where grass and water abound, and that where Don Quixote chanced to be suited the Yanguesan's purpose very well. It so happened, then, that Rocinante took a fancy to disport himself with their ladyships the ponies, and abandoning his usual gait and demeanour as he scented them, he, without asking leave of his master, got up a briskish little trot, and hastened to make known his wishes to them. They, however, it seemed, preferred their pasture to him, and received him with their heels and teeth to such effect that they soon broke his girths, and left him naked without a saddle to cover him. But what must have been worse to him was that the carriers, seeing the violence he was offering to their mares, came running up armed with stakes, and so belaboured him that they brought him sorely battered to the ground. By this time Don Quixote and Sancho, who had witnessed the drubbing of Rocinante, came up panting, and said Don Quixote to Sancho, "As far as I can see, friend Sancho, these are not knights, but base folk of low birth. I mention it because thou canst lawfully aid me in taking due vengeance for the insult offered to Rocinante before our eyes." "What the devil vengeance can we take," answered Sancho, "if they are more than 20, and we no more than 2, or indeed, perhaps, not more than 1.5. "I count for 100, replied Don Quixote, and without more words he drew his sword and attacked the Yanguesans, and excited and impelled by the example of his master, Sancho did the same. And to begin with, Don Quixote delivered a slash at one of them that laid open the leather jerkin he wore, together with a great portion of his shoulder. The Yanguesans, seeing themselves assaulted by only 2 men, while they were so many, betook themselves to their stakes, and driving the 2 into the middle, they began to lay on with great zeal and energy. In fact, at the second blow they brought Sancho to the ground, and Don Quixote fared the same way, all his skill and high mettle availing him nothing, and fate willed it that he should fall at the feet of Rocinante, who had not yet risen, whereby it may seem how furiously stakes can pound in angry boorish hands. Then, seeing the mischief they had done, the Yanguesans, with all the haste they could, loaded their team and pursued their journey, leaving the two adventurers a sorry sight and in sorrier mood. Sancho was the first to come to, and finding himself close to his master, he called to him in a weak and doleful voice, "Señor Don Quixote! Ah, Señor Don Quixote!" "What wouldst thou, brother Sancho?" answered Don Quixote in the same feeble, suffering tone as Sancho. "I would like, if it were possible," answered Sancho Panza, "your worship to give me a couple of sups of that potion of the fiery blas, if it be that you have any to hand there. Perhaps it will serve for broken bones as well as for wounds." "If I only had it here, wretch that I am, what more should we want?" said Don Quixote. "But I swear to thee, Sancho Panza, on the faith of a knight-errant, ere 2 days are over, unless fortune orders otherwise, I mean to have it in my possession, or my hand will have lost its cunning." "But in how many does your worship think we shall have the use of our feet?" answered Sancho Panza. "For myself, I must say I cannot guess how many," said the battered knight Don Quixote. "But I take all the blame upon myself, for I had no business to put hand to sword against men who were not dubbed knights like myself. And so I believe that in punishment for having transgressed the laws of chivalry, the God of battles has permitted this chastisement to be administered to me. For which reason, brother Sancho, it is well thou shouldst receive a hint on the matter which I am now about to mention to thee, for it is of much importance to the welfare of both of us. It is when thou shalt see rabble of this sort offering us insult, thou art not to wait till I draw sword against them, for I shall not do so at all. But do thou draw sword and chastise them to thy heart's content, and if any knights come to their aid and defence, I will take care to defend thee and assail them with all my might. And thou hast already seen by 1,000 signs and proofs what the might of this strong arm of mine is equal to." So uplifted had the poor gentleman become through the victory over the stout Biscayan. But Sancho did not so fully approve of his master's admonition as to let it pass without saying in reply, "Señor, I am a man of peace, meek and quiet, and I can put up with any affront, because I have a wife of children to support and bring up. So let it be likewise a hint to your worship, as it cannot be a mandate, that on no account will I draw sword either against clown or against knight, and that here before God I forgive the insults that have been offered me, whether they have been, are, or shall be offered me by high or low, rich or poor, noble or commoner, not accepting any rank or condition whatsoever." To all which his master said in reply, "I wish I had breath enough to speak somewhat easily, and that the pain I feel on this side would abate, so as to let me explain to thee, Panza, the mistake thou makest. Come now, sinner, suppose the winds of fortune, hitherto so adverse, should turn in our favour, filling the sails of our desires, so that safely and without impediment we put into port in some one of those islands I have promised thee. How would it be with thee, if on winning it I made thee lord of it? Why, thou wilt make it well nigh impossible, through not being a knight, nor having any desire to be one, nor possessing the courage nor the will to avenge insults or defend thy lordship. For thou must know that in newly conquered kingdoms and provinces the minds of the inhabitants are never so quiet nor so well disposed to the new lord that there is no fear of their making some move to change matters once more, and try, as they say, what chance may do for them. So it is essential that the new possessor should have good sense to enable him to govern, and valor to attack and defend himself, whatever may befall him. In what has now befallen us, answered Sancho, I'd have been well pleased to have that good sense and that valor your worship speaks of. But I swear on the faith of a poor man, I am more fit for plasters than for arguments. See if your worship can get up, and let us help Rocinante, though he does not deserve it, for he was the main cause of all this thrashing. I never thought it of Rocinante, for I took him to be a virtuous person and as quiet as myself. After all, they say right that it takes a long time to come to know people, and that there is nothing sure in this life. Who would have said it after such mighty slashes as your worship gave that unlucky knight-errant? There was coming travelling post, and at the very heels of them such a great storm of sticks as has fallen upon our shoulders. And yet thine, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, ought to be used to such squalls, but mine, reared in soft cloth and fine linen, it is plain they must feel more keenly the pain of this mishap. And if it were not that I imagine, why do I say imagine, know of a certainty that all these annoyances are very necessary accompaniments of the calling of arms, I would lay me down here to die of pure vexation. To this the squire replied, Señor, as these mishaps are what one reaps of chivalry, tell me if they happen very often, or if they have their own fixed time for coming to pass, because it seems to me that after 2 harvests we shall be no good for the 3rd, unless God in his infinite mercy helps us. Know, friend Sancho, answered Don Quixote, that the life of knight-errant is subject to 1,000 dangers and reverses, and neither more nor less is it within immediate possibility for knights-errant to become kings and emperors, as experience has shown in the case of many different knights with whose histories I am thoroughly acquainted. And I could tell thee now, if the pain would let me, of some who simply by might of arm have risen to the high stations I have mentioned, and those same, both before and after, experienced diverse misfortunes and miseries. For the valiant Amadis of Gaul found himself in the power of his mortal enemy Archelaus, the magician, who, it is positively asserted, holding him captive, gave him more than 200 lashes with the reins of his horse while tied to one of the pillars of a court. And moreover, there is a certain recondite author of no small authority who says that the Knight of Phoebus, being caught in a certain pitfall which opened under his feet in a certain castle, on falling found himself bound hand and foot in a deep pit underground, where they administered to him one of those things they call clysters, of sand and snow water, that well nigh finished him, and if he had not been succoured in that sore extremity by a sage, a great friend of his, it would have gone very hard with the poor knight. So I may well suffer in company with such worthy folk, for greater were the indignities which they had to suffer than those which we suffer. For I would have thee know, Sancho, that wounds caused by any instruments which happen by chance to be in hand inflict no indignity. And this is laid down in the law of the duel in express words. If, for instance, the cobbler strikes another with the last which he has in his hand, though it be in fact a piece of wood, it cannot be said for that reason that he whom he struck with it has been cudgelled. I say this lest thou shouldst imagine that because we have been drubbed in this affray, we have therefore suffered any indignity. For the arms those men carried, with which they pounded us, were nothing more than their stakes, and not one of them, so far as I remember, carried rapier, sword, or dagger. They gave me no time to see that much, answered Sancho, for hardly had I laid hand on my tizona when they signed the cross on my shoulders with their sticks, in such style that they took the sight out of my eyes and the strength out of my feet, stretching me where I now lie, and where thinking of whether all those stake strokes were an indignity or not gives me no uneasiness, which the pain of the blow does, for they will remain as deeply impressed on my memory as on my shoulders. For all that, let me tell thee, brother Panza, said Don Quixote, that there is no recollection which time does not put an end to, and no pain which death does not remove. And what greater misfortune can there be, replied Panza, than the one that waits for time to put an end to it and death remove it? If our mishap were not one of those that are cured with a couple of plasters, it would not be so bad. But I am beginning to think that all the plasters in a hospital almost won't be enough to put us right. No more of that plunk strength out of weakness, Sancho, as I mean to do, returned Don Quixote. And let us see how Rocinante is, for it seems to me that not the least share of this mishap has fallen to the lot of the poor beast. There is nothing wonderful in that, replied Sancho, since he is a knight-errant too. What I wonder at is that my beast should have come off scot-free where we came out scotched. Fortune always leaves a door open in adversity in order to bring relief to it, said Don Quixote. I say so because this little beast may now supply the want of Rocinante, carrying me hence to some castle where I may be cured of my wounds. And moreover, I shall not hold it any dishonour to be so mounted, for I remember having read how the good old Silenus, the tutor and instructor of the gay god of laughter, when he entered the city of the 100 gates, went very contentedly mounted on a handsome ass. It may be true that he went mounted, as your worship says, answered Sancho, but there is a great difference between going mounted and going slung like a sack of manure. To which Don Quixote replied, Wounds received in battle confer honor instead of taking it away. And so, friend Panza, say no more, but, as I told thee before, get up as well as thou canst, and put me on top of thy beast in whatever fashion pleases thee best, and let us go hence ere night comes on, and surprise us in these wilds. And yet I have heard your worship say, observed Panza, that it is very meet for knights-errant to sleep in wastes and deserts, and that they esteem it very good fortune. That is, said Don Quixote, when they cannot help it, or when they are in love. And so true is this, that there have been knights who have remained 2 years on rocks, in sunshine and shade and all the inclemencies of heaven, without their ladies knowing anything of it. And one of these was Amadis, when, under the name of Beltenebras, he took up his abode on the Penepobre, for I know not if it was 8 years or 8 months, for I am not very sure of the reckoning. At any rate, he stayed there doing penance for I know not what pique the Princess Oriana had against him. But no more of this now, Sancho, and make haste before a mishap like Rocinante's befalls the ass." "The very devil would be in it in that case," said Sancho, and letting off 30 oaths and 60 sighs and 120 maledictions and execrations on whomsoever it was that had brought him there, he raised himself, stopping halfway bent like a Turkish bow without power to bring himself upright. But with all his pains he saddled his ass, who too had gone astray somewhat. Yielding to the excessive license of the day, he next raised up Rocinante, and as for him, had he possessed a tongue to complain with, most assuredly neither Sancho nor his master would have been behind him. To be brief, Sancho fixed Don Quixote on the ass and secured Rocinante with a leading rein, and taking the ass by the halter, he proceeded more or less in the direction in which it seemed to him the high road might be, and as chance was conducting their affairs for them from good to better, he had not gone a short league when the road came in sight, and on it he perceived an inn, which to his annoyance and to the delight of Don Quixote must needs be a castle. Sancho insisted that it was an inn, and his master that it was not one, but a castle, and the dispute lasted so long that before the point was settled they had time to reach it, and into it Sancho entered with all his team without any further controversy. End of chapter 15.
Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby. Part 6, Chapter 16, of what happened to the ingenious gentleman in the inn, which he took to be a castle. The innkeeper, seeing Don Quixote slung across the ass, asked Sancho what was amiss with him. Sancho answered that it was nothing, only that he had fallen down from a rock and had his ribs a little bruised. The innkeeper had a wife whose disposition was not such as those of her calling commonly have, for she was by nature kind-hearted and felt for the sufferings of her neighbours. So she at once set about tending Don Quixote, and made her young daughter, a very comely girl, help her in taking care of her guest. There was besides in the inn, as servant, an Asturian lass with a broad face, flat poll, and snub nose, blind of one eye and not very sound in the other. The elegance of her shape, to be sure, made up for all her defects. She did not measure 7 palms from head to foot, and her shoulders, which overweighted her somewhat, made her contemplate the ground more than she liked. This graceful lass, then, helped the young girl, and the two made up a very bad bed for Don Quixote in a garret that showed evident signs of having formerly served for many years as a straw loft, in which there was also quartered a carrier, whose bed was placed a little beyond our Don Quixote's, and though only made of the pack-saddles and cloths of his mules, had much the advantage of it, as Don Quixote's consisted simply of 4 rough boards on 2 not very even trestles, a mattress, that for thinness might have passed for a quilt, full of pellets which, were they not seen through the rents to be wool, would to the touch have seemed pebbles in hardness, 2 sheets made of buckler leather, and a coverlet, the threads of which any one that chose might have counted without missing one in the reckoning. On this accursed bed Don Quixote stretched himself, and the hostess and her daughter soon covered him with plasters from top to toe, while Maritornes, for that was the name of the Asturian, held the light for them, and while plastering him, the hostess, observing how full of wheals Don Quixote was in some places, remarked that this had more the look of blows than of a fall. It was not blows, Sancho said, but that the rock had many points and projections, and that each of them had left its mark. Pray, señora, he added, manage to save some tow, as there will be no want of someone to use it, for my loins too are rather sore." "Then you must have fallen too," said the hostess. "I did not fall," said Sancho Panza, "but from shock I got at seeing my master fall, that I feel as if I had 1,000 thwacks." "That may well be," said the young girl, "for it has many a time happened to me to dream that I was falling down from a tower and never coming to the ground, and when I awoke from the dream to find myself as weak and shaken as if I had really fallen." "There is the point, signora," replied Sancho Panza, "that I, without dreaming at all, but being more awake than I am now, find myself with scarcely less wheels than my master Don Quixote." "How is the gentleman called?" asked Maritornes the Asturian. "Don Quixote of La Mancha," answered Sancho Panza, "and he is a knight-adventurer, and one of the best and stoutest that have seen the world this long time past." "What is a knight-adventurer?" said the lass. "Are you so new in the world as not to know?" answered Sancho Panza. "Well then, you must know, sister, that a knight-adventurer is a thing that in 2 words is seen drubbed and emperor, that is today the most miserable and needy being in the world, and tomorrow will have 2 or 3 crowns of kingdom to give his squire." "Then how is it," said the hostess, "that belonging to so good a master as this, you have not, to judge by appearances, even so much as a county?" "It is too soon yet," answered Sancho, "for we have only been a month going in quest of adventures, and so far we have met with nothing that can be called one, that when one thing is looked for another thing is found. However, if my master Don Quixote gets well of this wound, or fall, and I am left none the worse of it, I would not change my hopes for the best title in Spain." To all this conversation Don Quixote was listening very attentively, and sitting in bed as well as he could, and taking the hostess by the hand, he said to her, "Believe me, fair lady, you may call yourself fortunate in having in this castle of yours sheltered my person, which is such that if I do not myself praise it, it is because of what is commonly said, that self-praise debaseth. But my squire will inform you who I am. I only tell you that I shall preserve forever inscribed on my memory the service you have rendered me in order to tender you my gratitude while life shall last me, and would to heaven love held me not so enthralled and subject to its laws and to the eyes of that fair ingrate whom I name between my teeth, but that those of this lovely damsel might be the masters of my liberty." The hostess, her daughter, and the worthy Maritornes listened in bewilderment to the words of the knight-errant, for they understood about as much of them as if he had been talking Greek, though they could perceive they were all meant for expressions of goodwill and blandishments, and not being accustomed to this kind of language, they stared at him and wondered to themselves, for he seemed to them a man of a different sort from those they were used to, and thanking him in pothouse phrase for his civility, they left him, while the Asturian gave her attention to Sancho, who needed it no less than his master. The carrier had made an arrangement with her for recreation that night, and she had given him her word that when the guests were quiet and the family asleep, she would come in search of him and meet his wishes unreservedly. And it is said of this good lass that she never made promises of the kind without fulfilling them, even though she made them in a forest and without any witness present, for she plumed herself greatly on being a lady, and held it no disgrace to be in such an employment as servant in an inn, because, she said, misfortunes and ill luck had brought her to that position. The hard, narrow, wretched, rickety bed of Don Quixote stood first in the middle of this starlit stable, and close beside it Sancho made his, which merely consisted of a rush mat and a blanket that looked as if it was of threadbare canvas rather than of wool. Next to these 2 beds was that of the carrier, made up, as has been said, and all the trappings of the 2 best mules he had, though there were 12 of them, sleek, plump, and in prime condition, for he was one of the rich carriers of Arevalo, according to the author of this history, who particularly mentions this carrier because he knew him very well, and they even say was in some degree a relation of his. Besides which, Cidi Harnete Benengeli was a historian of great research and accuracy in all things, as is very evident, since he would not pass over in silence those that have been already mentioned, however trifling and insignificant they might be, an example that might be followed by those grave historians who relate transactions so curtly and briefly that we hardly get a taste of them, all the substance of the work being left in the inkstand from carelessness, perverseness, or ignorance. 1,000 blessings on the author of Tablante de Ricamonte, and that of the other book, in which the deeds of the Conde Tomillas are recounted. With what minuteness they describe everything. To proceed, then, after having paid a visit to his team and given them their second feed, the carrier stretched himself on his pack-saddles and lay waiting for his conscientious Maritornes. Sancho was by this time plastered and had laid down, and though he strove to sleep, the pain of his ribs would not let him, while Don Quixote with the pain of his had his eyes as wide open as a hare's. The inn was all in silence, and in the whole of it there was no light except that given by a lantern that hung burning in the middle of the gateway. This strange stillness, and the thoughts always present to our knight's mind, of the incidents described at every turn in the books that were the cause of his misfortune, conjured up to his imagination as extraordinary a delusion as can well be conceived, which was that he fancied himself to have reached a famous castle, for, as has been said, all the inns he lodged in were castles to his eyes, and that the daughter of the innkeeper was daughter of the lord of the castle, and that she, won by his high-bred bearing, had fallen in love with him, and had promised to come to his bed for a while that night without the knowledge of her parents, and holding all this fantasy that he had constructed as solid fact, he began to feel uneasy and to consider the perilous risk which his virtue was about to encounter, and he resolved in his heart to commit no treason to his lady Dulcinea del Toboso, even though the Queen Guinevere herself and the Dame Quintanona should present themselves before him. While he was taken up with these vagaries, then, the time and the hour, an unlucky one for him, arrived for the Asturian to come, who in her smock with bare feet and her hair gathered into a fustian coif, with noiseless and cautious steps entered the chamber where the three were quartered, in quest of the carrier. But scarcely had she gained the door, when Don Quixote perceived her, and sitting up in his bed, in spite of his plasters and the pain of his ribs, he stretched out his arms to receive his beauteous damsel. The Asturian, who went all doubled up, and in silence with her hands before her feeling for her lover, encountered the arms of Don Quixote, who grasped her tightly by the wrist, and drawing her towards him, while she dared not utter a word, made her sit down on the bed. He then felt her smock, and, although it was of sackcloth, it appeared to him to be of the finest and softest silk. On her wrists she wore some glass beads, but to him they had the sheen of precious orient pearls. Her hair, which in some measure resembled a horse's mane, he rated as threads of the brightest golds of Araby, whose refulgence dimmed the sun himself. Her breath, which no doubt smelt of yesterday's stale salad, seemed to him to diffuse a sweet aromatic fragrance from her mouth, and in short, he drew her portrait in his imagination with the same features and in the same style as that which he had seen in his books of the other princesses who, smitten by love, came with all the adornments that are here set down to see the sorely wounded knight, and so great was the poor gentleman's blindness that neither touch nor smell nor anything else about the good lass that would have made any but a carrier vomit were enough to undeceive him. On the contrary, he was persuaded that he had the goddess of beauty in his arms, and holding her firmly in his grasp, he went on to say in a low, tender voice, "Would that found myself, lovely and exalted lady, in a position to repay such a favour as that which you, by the sight of your great beauty, have granted me. But fortune, which is never weary of persecuting the good, has chosen to place me upon this bed, where I lie so bruised and broken that though my inclination would gladly comply with yours, it is impossible. Besides, to this impossibility another yet greater is to be added, which is the faith that I have pledged to the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso, sole lady of my most secret thoughts, and were it not that this stood in the way, I should not be so insensible a knight as to miss the happy opportunity which your great goodness has offered me. Maritornes was fretting and sweating at finding herself held so fast by Don Quixote, and not understanding or heeding the words he addressed to her, she strove without speaking to free herself. The worthy carrier, whose unholy thoughts kept him awake, was aware of his doxy the moment she entered the door, and was listening attentively to all Don Quixote said, and jealous that the Asturian should have broken her word with him for another, drew nearer to Don Quixote's bed, and stood still to see what would come of this talk which he could not understand. But when he perceived the wench struggling to get free, and Don Quixote striving to hold her, not relishing the joke, he raised his arm and delivered such a terrible cuff on the lank jaws of the amorous knight, that he bathed all his mouth in blood, and not content with this, he mounted on his ribs, and with his feet tramped all over them at a pace rather smarter than a trot. The bed, which was somewhat crazy and not very firm on its feet, unable to support the additional weight of the carrier, came to the ground, and at the mighty crash of this the innkeeper awoke, and at once concluded that it must be some brawl of Maritornes, because after calling loudly to her he got no answer. With this suspicion he got up, and lighting a lamp, hastened to the quarter where he had heard the disturbance. The wench, seeing that her master was coming, and knowing that his temper was terrible, frightened and panic-stricken, made for the bed of Sancho Panza, who still slept, and crouching upon it, made a ball of herself. The innkeeper came in, exclaiming, "Where art thou, strumpet? Of course this is some of thy work." At this Sancho awoke, and feeling this mass almost on top of him, fancied he had a nightmare, and began to distribute fisticuffs all around, of which a certain share fell upon Maritornes, who, irritated by the pain and flinging modesty aside, paid back so many in return to Sancho that she woke him up in spite of himself. He then, finding himself so handled, by whom he knew not, raising himself up as well as he could, grappled with Maritornes, and he and she between them began the bitterest and drollest scrimmage in the world. The carrier, however, perceiving by the light of the innkeeper candle how it fared with his lady love, quitting Don Quixote, ran to bring her the help she needed, and the innkeeper did the same, but with a different intention, for his was to chastise the lass, as he believed that beyond a doubt she alone was the cause of all the harmony. And so, as the saying is, catch to rat, rat to rope, rope to stick, the carrier pounded Sancho, Sancho the lass, she him, and the innkeeper her, and all worked away so briskly that they did not give themselves a moment's rest, and the best of it was that the innkeeper's lamp went out, and as they were left in the dark, they all laid on one upon the other in a mass so unmercifully that there was not a sound spot left where a hand could light. It so happened that there was lodging that night in the inn a quadrillo of what they call the Old Holy Brotherhood of Toledo, who, also hearing the extraordinary noise of the conflict, seized his staff and the tin case with his warrants, and made his way in the dark into the room, crying, "Hold, in the name of jurisdiction! Hold, in the name of the Holy Brotherhood!" The first that he came upon was the pummeled Don Quixote, who lay stretched senseless on his back upon his broken-down bed, and his hand falling on the beard as he felt about, he continued to cry, "Help for the jurisdiction!" But perceiving that he whom he had laid hold of did not move or stir, he concluded that he was dead, and that those in the room were his murderers, and with this suspicion he raised his voice still higher, calling out, "Shut the inn-gate! See that no one goes out! They have killed a man here!" This cry startled them all, and each dropped the contest at the point at which the voice reached him. The innkeeper retreated to his room, the carrier to his pack-saddles, the lass to her crib. The unlucky Don Quixote and Sancho alone were unable to move from where they were. The cuadrillero on this let go Don Quixote's beard, and went out to look for a light to search for and apprehend the culprits, but not finding one, as the innkeeper had purposely extinguished the lantern on retreating to his room, he was compelled to have recourse to the hearth, where after much time and trouble he lit another lamp. End of chapter 16.
Don Quixote, Volume 1 by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Part 9, Chapter 17, in which are contained the innumerable troubles which the brave Don Quixote and his good squire Sancho Panza endured in the inn, which to his misfortune he took to be a castle. By this time Don Quixote had recovered from his swoon, and in the same tone of voice in which he had called to his squire the day before, when he lay stretched in the vale of the Styx, he began calling to him now. "Sancho, my friend, art thou asleep? Sleepest thou, friend Sancho?" "How can I sleep? Curses on it!" returned Sancho discontentedly and bitterly, "when it is plain that all the devils have been at me this night." "Thou mayest well believe that," answered Don Quixote, "because either I know little, or this castle is enchanted, for thou must know, but this that I am now about to tell thee thou must swear to keep secret until after my death." "I swear it," answered Sancho. "I say so," continued Don Quixote, "because I hate taking away anyone's good name." "I say," replied Sancho, "that I swear to hold my tongue about it till the end of your worship's days, and gone grat, I may be able to let it out tomorrow." "Do I do thee such injuries, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "that thou wouldst see me dead so soon?" "It is not for that," replied Sancho, "but because I hate keeping things long, and I don't want them to grow rotten with me from over-keeping." "At any rate," said Don Quixote, "I have more confidence in thy affection and good nature, and so I would have thee know that this night there befall me one of the strangest adventures that I could describe, and to relate to it thou must know that a little while ago the daughter of the lord of this castle came to me, and she is the most elegant and beautiful damsel that could be found in the wide world. What I could tell thee of the charms of her person, her lovely wit, of her secret matters which, to preserve the fealty I owe to my lady Dulcinea del Toboso, I shall pass over unnoticed and in silence. I will only tell thee that either fate being envious of so great a boon placed in my hands by good fortune, or perhaps, and this is more probable, this castle being, as I have already said, enchanted. At the time when I was engaged in the sweetest and most amorous discourse with her, there came, without me seeing or knowing whence it came, a hand attached to some arm of some huge giant, that planted such a cuff on my jaws that I have them all bathed in blood, and then pummeled me in such a way that I am worse plight than yesterday when the carriers, on account of Rocinante's misbehaviour, inflicted on us the injury thou knowest of, whence conjecture that there must be some enchanted Moor guarding the treasure of this damsel's beauty, and that it is not for me." "Not for me either," said Sancho, "for more than 400 Moors have so thrashed me that the drubbing of the stakes was cakes and fancy bread to it. But tell me, señor, what do you call this excellent and rare adventure that has left us as we are left now, though your worship was not so badly off, having in your arms the incomparable beauty you spoke of, but I, what did I have, except the heaviest wax that I think I had in all my life? Unlucky me and the mother that bore me, for I am not a knight-errant, and never expect to be one, and all the mishaps the greater part falls to my share." "Then thou hast been thrashed too?" said Don Quixote. "Didn't I say so? Worse luck to my line," said Sancho. "Be not distressed, friend," said Don Quixote, "for I will now make the precious balsam which we shall cure ourselves in the twinkling of an eye." By this time the cuadrillero had succeeded in lighting the lamp, and came in to see the men that he had thought been killed, and as Sancho caught sight of him at the door, seeing him coming in his shirt with a cloth on his head and a lamp in his hand, and a very forbidding countenance, he said to his master, "Señor, can it be that this the enchanted Moor coming back to give us more castination, if there anything still left in the ink bottle?" "It cannot be the Moor," answered Don Quixote, "for those under enchantment do not let themselves be seen by anyone." "If they do not let themselves be seen, they let themselves be felt," said Sancho. "If not, let my shoulders speak to the point." "Mine could speak too," said Don Quixote, "but that is not a sufficient reason for believing that what we see is the enchanted Moor." The officer came up, and finding them engaged in such a peaceful conversation, stood amazed, though Don Quixote, to be sure, still lay on his back, unable to move from pure pummelling and plasters. The officer turned to him and said, "Well, how goes it, good man?" "I would speak more politely if I were you," replied Don Quixote. "Is it the way of this country to address knight-errants in that style, you booby?" The quadrillero, finding himself so disrespectfully treated by such a sorry-looking individual, lost his temper, and raising the lamp full of oil, smote Don Quixote such a blow with it on the head that he gave him a badly broken pate. Then, all being in darkness, he went out, and Sancho Panza said, "That is certainly the enchanted Moor, señor, and he keeps the treasure for others, and for us only the cuffs and lamp wax." "That is the truth," answered Don Quixote, "and there is no use of troubling oneself about these matters of enchantment, or being angry or vexed at them, for as they are as invisible and visionary we shall find no one on whom to avenge ourselves. Do what we may, rise, Sancho, if thou canst, and call the alcaide of this forest, and get him to give me a little oil, wine, salt, and rosemary, to make the sorcerer's balsam, for indeed I believe that I have great need of it now, because I am losing much blood from the wound that phantom gave me." Sancho got up with pain enough in his bones, and went after the innkeeper in the dark, and meeting the officer, who was looking to see what had become of his enemy, he said to him, "Señor, whoever you are, do us the favour and kindness to give us a little rosemary, oil, salt, and wine, for it is wanted to cure one of our best knights-errant on earth, who lies on yonder bed, wounded by the hands of the enchanted Moor that is in this inn." When the officer heard him talk in this way, he took him for a man out of his senses, and as day was now beginning to break, he opened the inn gate, and calling the host, he told him what this good man wanted. The host furnished him with what he required, and Sancho brought it to Don Quixote, who, with his hand to his head, was bewailing the pain of the blow of the lamp, which had done him no more than raising a couple of rather large lumps, and what he fancied blood was only the sweat that flowed from him in his sufferings during the late storm. To be brief, he took the materials of which he made a compound, mixing them all and boiling them a good while until it seemed to him they had come to perfection. He then asked for some vial to pour it into, and there was not one in the inn. He decided on putting it into a tin oil bottle or flask, of which the host made him a free gift. And over the flask he repeated more than 80 paternosters, and as many more Ave Marias, Salves, and Credos, accompanying each word with a cross by the way of benediction, at all which there were present Sancho, the innkeeper, and the quadrillero, for the carrier was now peacefully engaged in attending to the comfort of his mules. This being accomplished, he felt anxious to make trial himself, on the spot, of the virtue of this precious balsam, and as he considered it, and so he drank near a quart of what could not be put into the flask, and remained in the pigskin in which had been boiled, but scarcely had he done drinking when he began to vomit in such a way that nothing was left in his stomach, and with the pangs and spasms of vomiting he broke into a profuse sweat, on account of which he bade them cover him up and leave him alone. They did so, and he lay sleeping more than 3 hours, at the end of which he awoke and felt great bodily relief, and so much ease from his bruises that he thought himself quite cured, and verily believed that he had hit upon the balsam of Febreze, and that with this remedy he might thenceforward, without any fear, face any kind of destruction, battle, or combat, however perilous it might be. Sancho Panza, who also regarded the amendment of his master as miraculous, begged him to give him what was left in the pigskin, which was no small quantity. Don Quixote consented, and he, taking it with both hands, in good faith and with a better will, gulped it down and drained off very little less than his master. But the fact is that the stomach of poor Sancho was of necessity not so delicate as that of his master, and so, before vomiting, he was seized with such gripings and retchings, and such sweats and faintness, that verily and truly he believed his last hour had come, and finding himself so racked and tormented, he cursed the balsam and the thief that had given it to him. Don Quixote, seeing him in this state, said, "It is my belief, Sancho, that this mischief comes not of thy being dubbed a knight, for I am persuaded this liquor cannot be good for those who are not so." "If your worship knew that," returned Sancho, "woe betide me and all my kindred! Why did you let me taste it?" At this moment the draught took effect, and the poor squire began to discharge both ways at such a rate that the rush mat on which he had thrown himself and the canvas blanket he had covering him were fit for nothing afterwards. He sweated and perspired with such paroxysms and convulsions that not only he himself, but all the present thought his end had come. This tempest and tribulation lasted about 2 hours, at the end of which he was left, not like his master, but so weak and exhausted that he could not stand. Don Quixote, however, was, as has been said, felt himself relieved and well, and was eager to take his departure at once in quest of adventures, as it seemed to him that all the time he loitered there was a fraud upon the world and those in it who stood in need of his help and protection, all the more when he had the security and confidence in balsam afforded him. And so, urged by this impulse, he saddled Rocinante himself and put the pack saddle on his squire's breast, whom likewise he helped to dress and mount the ass, after which he mounted his horse, and turning to a corner of the inn he laid hold of a pike that stood there, to serve him by way of lance. All that were in the inn, who were more than 20 persons, stood watching him. The innkeeper's daughter was likewise observing him, and he too never took his eyes off her, and from time to time fetched a sigh that he seemed to pluck up from the depths of his bowels, but they all thought it must be from the pain he felt in his ribs, and at any rate they who had seen him plastered the night before thought so. As soon as they both mounted at the gate of the inn, he called to the host and said in a very grave and measured voice, "Many and great are the favours, Señor Alcaide, and that I have received in this castle of yours, and I remain under the deepest obligation to be grateful to you for them all the days of my life. If I can repay them in avenging you of any arrogant foe who may have wronged you, know that my calling is no other than to aid the weak, to avenge those who suffer wrong, and to chastise perfidy. Search your memory, and if you find anything of this kind, you need only tell me of it, and I promise you by the order of knighthood which I have received to procure you satisfaction and reparation to the utmost of your desire." The innkeeper brought to him with equal calmness, "Sir Knight, I do not want your worship to avenge me of any wrong, because when any is done me, I can take what vengeance seems good to me. The only thing I want is that you pay me the score that you have run up in the inn last night, as well for the straw and barley of your 2 beasts, as for supper and beds." "Then this is an inn?" said Don Quixote. "And a very respectable one," said the innkeeper. "I have been under a mistake all this time," answered Don Quixote, "for in truth I thought this was a castle, and not a bad one. But since it appears that it is not a castle but an inn, all that can be done now is that you should excuse the payment, for I cannot contravene the rules of knight-errant, of whom I know as a fact, and up to the present I have read nothing to the contrary, that they never paid for lodging or anything else in the inn where they might be. For any hospitality that might be offered them is their due by law, and right in return for the insufferable toil they endure in seeking adventures by night and by day, in summer and in winter, on foot and on horseback, in hunger and thirst, cold and heat, exposed to all the inclemencies of heaven and the hardships of earth." "I have little to do with that," replied the innkeeper. "Pay me what you owe me, and let us have no more talk of chivalry, for all I care about is to get my money." "You are a stupid, scurvy innkeeper," said Don Quixote, and putting spurs to Rocinante and bringing his pike to the slope, he rode out of the inn before anyone could stop him, and pushed on some distance without looking to see if his squire was following him. The innkeeper, when he saw him go without paying him, ran to get payment of Sancho, who said that as his master would not pay, neither would he, because, being as he was squire to a knight-errant, the same rule and reason held good for him as for his master with regard to not paying anything in inns and hostelries. And at this the innkeeper waxed very wroth, and threatened, if he did not pay, to compel him in a way that he would not like, to which Sancho made answer that by the law of chivalry his master had received he would not pay a rap, though it cost him his life, for the excellent and ancient usage of knights-errants was not going to be violated by him, nor should the squires of such as were yet to come into the world ever complain of him or reproach him without breaking so just a privilege. The ill luck of the unfortunate Sancho so ordered that among the company in the inn there were 4 wool-carders from Segovia, 3 needle-makers from the colt of Cordoba, and 2 lodgers from this fair Seville, lively fellows, tender-hearted, fond of a joke, and playful, who, almost as if instigated and moved by a common impulse, made up to Sancho and dismounted him from his ass, while one of them went in for the blanket of the host's bed. But on flinging him into they looked up, and seeing that the ceiling was somewhat lower than what they required for their work, they decided upon going out into the yard, which was bounded by the sky, and there, putting Sancho in the middle of the blanket, they began to raise him high, making sport with him as they would with a dog at stove-tide. The cries of the poor blanketed wretch were so loud that they reached the ears of his master, who, halting to listen attentively, was persuaded that some new adventure was coming, until he clearly perceived that it was his squire who uttered them. Wheeling about, he came up to the inn with a laborious gallop, and finding it shut, went round to see if he could find some way of getting in. But as soon as he came to the wall of the yard, which was not very high, he discovered the game that was being played with his squire. He saw him rising and falling in the air with such grace and nimbleness that, had his rage allowed him, it is my belief he would have laughed. He tried to climb from his horse on to the top of the wall, but he was so bruised and battered that he could not even dismount, and so, from the back of his horse he began to utter such maledictions and objurgations against those who were blanketing Sancho as it would be impossible to write down accurately. They, however, did not stay their laughter or their work for this, nor did the flying Sancho cease his lamentations, mingled now with threats, now the entreaties, but all to little purpose, or none at all, until from pure weariness they left off. They then brought him his ass, and mounting him on top of it, they put his jacket round him, and the compassionate Maritone, seeing him so exhausted, thought fit to refresh him with a jug of water, and that it might be all the cooler she fetched it from the well. Sancho took it, and as he was raising it to his mouth he was stopped by the cries of his master, exclaiming, "Sancho, my son, drink not water, drink it not, my son, for it will kill thee. See, here I have the blessed balsam," and he held up the flask of liquor, "and with drinking 2 drops of it thou wilt certainly be restored." At these words Sancho turned his eyes asquint, and in a still louder voice said, "Can it be your worship has forgotten that I am not a knight, or do you want me to end up by vomiting what bowels I have left after last night? Keep your liquor in the name of all the devils, and leave me to myself." And at one and the same instant he left off talking and began drinking. But as the first sup he perceived it was water, he did not care to go on with it, and begged Maritornes to fetch him some wine, which she did with a right good will, and paid for with her own money. For indeed they say of her that, though she was in that line of life, there is some faint and distant resemblance to a Christian about her. When Sancho had done drinking, he dug his heels into his ass, and the gate of the inn being thrown open, he passed out very well pleased at having paid nothing and carried his point, though it had been at the expense of his usual sureties his shoulders. It is true that the innkeeper detained his alforjas in payment of what was owing to him, but Sancho took his departure in such a flurry that he never missed him. The innkeeper, as soon as he saw him off, wanted to bar the gate close, but the blanketers would not agree to it, for they were fellows who would not have cared 2 farthings for Don Quixote, even had he been really one of the knight-errants of the Round Table. End of Part 9. Chapter 17.
Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Volume 1, Part 7, Chapter 18, in which is related the discourse Sancho Panza held with his master Don Quixote, and other adventures worth relating. Sancho reached his master so limp and faint that he could not urge on his beast. When Don Quixote saw the state he was in, he said, "I have now come to the conclusion, good Sancho, that this castle or inn is beyond a doubt enchanted, because those who have so atrociously diverted themselves with thee, what can they be but phantoms or beings of another world? And I hold this confirmed by having noticed that when I was by the wall of the yard witnessing the acts of thy sad tragedy, it was out of my power to mount upon it, nor could I even dismount from Rocinante, because they no doubt had me enchanted. For I swear to thee by the faith of what I am, that if I had been able to climb up or dismount, I would have avenged thee in such a way that those braggart thieves would have remembered their freak for ever, even though in so doing I knew that I contravened the laws of chivalry, which, as I have often told thee, do not permit a knight to lay hands on him who is not one, save in case of urgent and great necessity, in defence of his own life and person." "I would have avenged myself too if I could," said Sancho, "whether I had been dubbed knight or not. But I could not, though for my part I am persuaded those who amused themselves with me were not phantoms or enchanted men, as your worship says, but men of flesh and bone like ourselves. And they all had their names, for I heard them name them when they were tossing me, and one was called Pedro Martinez, and another Tenorio Hernandez, and the innkeeper, I heard, was called Juan Palamique, the left-handed, so that, señor, your not being able to leap over the wall of the yard or dismount from your horse came of something else besides enchantments. And what I make clearly from all of this is, that these adventures we go seeking will in the end lead us into such misadventures that we shall not know what is our right foot, and that the best and wisest thing, according to my small wits, would be for us to return home, now that it is harvest time, and attend to our business, and give over wandering from Zecca to Mecca, and from pail to bucket, as the saying is." "How little thou knowest about chivalry, Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "Hold thy peace and have patience. The day will come when thou shalt see with thine own eyes what an honourable thing it is to wander in the pursuit of this calling. Nay, tell me, what greater pleasure can there be in the world, or what delight can equal that of winning a battle, and triumphing over one's enemy? None, beyond all doubt." "Very likely," answered Sancho, "though I do not know it. All I know is that since we have been knights-errant, or since your worship has been one, for I have no right to reckon myself one of so honourable a number, we have never won any battle except the one with the Biscayne. and even that out of your worship came with half an ear and half a helmet the less. And from that till now it has been all cudgellings and more cudgellings, cuffs and more cuffs, I getting the blanketing over and above, and falling in with enchanted persons on whom I cannot avenge myself, so as to know what the delight, as your worship calls it, of conquering an enemy is like." "That is what vexes me, and what ought to vex thee, Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "But henceforward I will endeavour to have at hand some sword made by such craft that no kind of enchantments can take effect upon him who carries it, and it is even possible that fortune may procure for me that which belonged to the Armadas when he was called the Knight of the Burning Sword, which was one of the best swords that ever knight in the world possessed. For, besides having the said virtue, it cut like a razor, and there was no armour, however strong and enchanted it might be, that could resist it." "Such is my luck," said Sancho, "that even if that happened, and your worship found some such sword, it would, like the balsam, turn out serviceable and good for dubbed knights only, and as for the squires, they might sup sorrow." "Fear not that, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Heaven will deal better by thee." Thus talking, Don Quixote and his squire were going along, when, on the road they were following, Don Quixote perceived approaching them a large and thick cloud of dust, on seeing which he turned to Sancho and said, "This is the day, Sancho, on which will be seen the boon of my fortune is reserving for me. This, I say, is the day on which, as much as on any other, shall be displayed the might of my arm, and on which I shall do deeds that shall remain written in the book of fame for all ages to come. Seest thou that cloud of dust which rises yonder? Well then, all that is churned up by a vast army composed of various and countless nations that comes marching there." "According to that there must be two," said Sancho, "for on this opposite side also there rises just such another cloud of dust." Don Quixote turned to look and found that it was true, and rejoicing exceedingly he concluded that there were two armies about to engage and encounter in the midst of that broad plain, for at all times and seasons his fancy was full of the battles, enchantments, adventures, crazy feats, loves, and defiances that are recorded in the books of chivalry, and everything he said, thought, or did had reference to such things. Now the cloud of dust he had seen was raised by two great droves of sheep, coming along the same road in opposite directions, which, because of the dust, did not become visible until they drew near. But Don Quixote asserted so positively that they were armies that Sancho was led to believe it and say, "Well, what are we to do, señor?" "What?" said Don Quixote. "Give aid and assistance to the weak, and those who need it. And thou must know, Sancho, that this which comes opposite to us is conducted and led by the mighty Emperor Alifanfaron, lord of the great isle of Trapobana. This other that marches behind me is that of his enemy, the king of the Garamantas, Pentapolin of the bare arm, for he always goes into battle with his right arm bare." "But why are these two lords such enemies?" "They are at enmity," replied Don Quixote, "because this Alifanfaron is a furious pagan and is in love with the daughter of Pentapolin, who is a very beautiful and moreover gracious lady and a Christian, and her father is unwilling to bestow her upon the pagan king unless he first abandons the religion of his false prophet Mahomet and adopts his own." "By my beard," said Sancho, "but Pentapolin does quite right, and I will help him as much as I can." "In that thou wilt do what is thy duty, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for to engage in battles of this sort it is not requisite to be a dubbed knight." "That I can well understand," answered Sancho, "but where shall we put this ass where we may be sure to find him after the fray is over? For I believe it has not been the custom so far to go into battle on a beast of this kind." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "and what you had best do with him is to leave him to take his chances whether he be lost or not, for the horses we shall have when we come out victors will be so many that even Rocinante will run a risk of being changed for another. But attend to me and observe, for I wish to give thee some account of the chief knights who accompany these two armies, And that thou mayest the better see and mark, let us withdraw to that hillock which rises yonder, whence both armies may be seen. They did so, and placed themselves on a rising ground, from which the two droves that Don Quixote made armies of might have been plainly seen if the clouds of dust they raised had not obscured them and blinded the sight. Nevertheless, seeing in his imagination what he did not see, and what did not exist, he began thus in a loud voice. That knight whom thou seest yonder in yellow armour, who bears upon his shield a lion crowned crouching at the feet of a damsel, is the valiant Lorcalco, lord of the Silver Bridge. That one in armour, with flowers of gold, who bears on his shield 3 crowns argent on an azure field, is the dreaded Mocolembo, Grand Duke of Curacia. That other of gigantic frame on his right hand is the ever dauntless Brandabarbaran de Boliche, lord of the 3 Arabias, who for armour wears that serpent skin, and has for shield a gate, which according to tradition is one of those of the temple that Samson brought to the ground, when by his death he revenged himself upon his enemies. But turn thine eyes to the other side, and thou shalt see in front, and in the van of this other army, the ever victorious and never vanquished Timonel of Cargiona, Prince of New Biscay, who comes in armour with arms quartered azure, vert, white, and yellow, and bears on his shield a cat, or on a field tawny, with a motto that says Maiu, which is the beginning of the name of his lady, who according to report is the peerless Maiolina, daughter of the Archduke Alfenequen of the Algarve. The other, who burdens and presses the loins of that powerful charger, and bears arms white as snow, and a shield blank and without any device, is a novice knight, a Frenchman by birth, Pierre Papin by name, lord of the baronies of Outrake. That other, who with iron-shod heels strikes the flanks of that nimble party-coloured zebra, and for arms bears azure vert, is the mighty Duke of Nurbia, Espartafilardo del Bosque, who bears for device on his shield an asparagus plant, with a motto in Castilian that says, Rastria mi suerte. And so he went on, naming a number of knights of one squadron or the other out of his imagination, and to all he assigned off-hand their arms, colours, devices, and mottos, carried away by the illusions of his unheard-of craze, and without a pause he continued, People of divers nations compose this squadron in front. Here are those that drink of the sweet waters of the famous Xanthus, those that scour the woody Massilian plains, those that sift the pure fine gold of Arabia Felix, those that enjoy the famed cool banks of the crystal Thermodon, those that in many and various ways divert the streams of the golden Pactolus, the Numidians, faithless in their promises, the Persians renowned in archery, the Parthians and the Medes that fight as they fly, the Arabs that ever shift their dwellings, the Scythians as cruel as they are fair, the Ethiopians with pierced lips, and an infinity of other nations whose features I recognize and descry, though I cannot recall their names. In this other squadron there come those that drink of the crystal streams of the olive-bearing Baetis, those that make smooth their countenance with the water of the ever-rich and golden Tagus, those that rejoice in the fertilizing flow of the divine Genile, those that roam the Tartesian plains abounding in pasture, those that take their pleasure in the Elysian meadows of Jerez, the rich Manjigans crowned with ruddy ears of corn, the wearers of iron, old relics of the Gothic race, those that bathe in the Pasquirga, known for its gentle current, those that feed their herds along the spreading pastures of the winding Guadinia, famed for its hidden course, those that tremble with the cold of the pine-clad Pyrenees, or the dazzling snow of the lofty Apennine, in a word, as many as all Europe includes and contains. Good God! What a number of countries and nations he named, giving to each its proper attributes with marvellous readiness, brimful and saturated with what he had read in his lying books. Sancho Panza hung upon his words without speaking, and from time to time turned to try if he could see the knights and giants his master was describing, and as he could not make out one of them, he said to him, "Señor, devil take it if there's a sign of any man you talk of, knight or giant, in the whole thing. Maybe it's all enchantment, like the phantoms last night." "How canst thou say that?" answered Don Quixote. "Dost thou not hear the neighing of the steeds, the braying of the trumpets, the roll of the drums?" "I hear nothing but a great bleating of ewes and sheep," said Sancho, which was true, for by this time the two flocks had come close. "The fear thou art in, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "prevents thee from seeing or hearing correctly, for one of the effects of fear is to derange the senses and make things appear different from what they are. If thou art in such fear, withdraw to one side and leave me to myself, for alone I suffice to bring victory to that side to which I shall give my aid." And in so saying, he gave Rocinante the spur, and putting the lance in rest, shot down the slope like a thunderbolt. Sancho shouted after him, crying, "Come back, Señor Don Quixote! I vow to God they are sheep and ewes you are charging. Come back! Unlucky the father that begot me! What madness is this? Look, there is no giant, nor knight, nor cats, nor arms, nor shields quartered or whole, nor vair azure or bedevilled. What are you about? Sinner that I am before God!" But not for all these entreaties did Don Quixote turn back. On the contrary, he went on shouting out, "Ho, knights, ye who follow and fight under the banners of the valiant Emperor Pentapolin of the bare arm, follow me all. Ye shall see how easily I shall give him his revenge over his enemy Alifanfaron of the Trapobana." So saying, he dashed into the midst of the squadron of ewes, and began spearing them with as much spirit and intrepidity as if he were transfixing mortal enemies in earnest. The shepherds and drovers accompanying the flock shouted to him to desist. Seeing it was no use, they ungirt their slings and began to salute his ears with stones as big as one's fist. Don Quixote gave no heed to the stones, but letting drive right and left, kept saying, "Where art thou, proud Alifanfaron? Come before me. I am a single knight who would fain prove thy prowess hand to hand, and make thee yield thy life a penalty for the wrong thou dost to the valiant Pentapolin Garamanta." Here came a sugar plum from the brook that struck him on the side and buried a couple of ribs in his body. Feeling himself so smitten, he imagined himself slain or badly wounded for certain, and recollecting his liquor, he drew out his flask, and putting it to his mouth began to pour the contents into his stomach. But ere he had succeeded in swallowing what seemed to him enough, there came another almond, which struck him on the hand and on the flask so fairly that it smashed it to pieces, knocking 3 or 4 teeth and grinders out of his mouth in its course, and sorely crushing 2 fingers of his hand. Such was the force of the first blow and of the second, that the poor knight, in spite of himself, came down backwards off his horse. The shepherds came up and felt sure they had killed him. So in all haste they collected their flock together, took up the dead beasts, of which there were more than 7, and made off without waiting to ascertain anything further. All this time Sancho stood on the hill, watching the crazy feats his master was performing, and tearing his beard, and cursing the hour and the occasion when fortune had made him acquainted with him. Seeing him then brought to the ground, and that the shepherds had taken themselves off, he ran to him and found him in very bad case, though not unconscious, and said he, "Did I not tell you to come back, Señor Don Quixote, and that what you were going to attack were not armies but droves of sheep?" "That's how that thief of a sage, my enemy, can alter and falsify things," answered Don Quixote. "Thou must know, Sancho, that it is a very easy matter for those of his sort to make us believe what they choose, and this malignant being who persecutes me, envious of the glory he knew I was to win in this battle, has turned the squadrons of the enemy into droves of sheep. At any rate, do this much, I beg of thee, Sancho, to undeceive thyself, and see that what I say is true. Mount thy ass, and follow them quietly, and thou shalt see that when they have gone some little distance from this, they will return to their original shape, and ceasing to be sheep, become men in all respects as I described them to thee at first. But go not just yet, for I want thy help and assistance. Come hither, and see how many of my teeth and grinders are missing, for I feel as if there was not one left in my mouth. Sancho came so close that he almost put his eyes into his mouth. Now just at that moment the balsam had acted on the stomach of Don Quixote, so at the very instant when Sancho came to examine his mouth, he discharged all its contents with more force than a musket, and full onto the beard of the compassionate squire. "Holy Mary!" cried Sancho, "what is this that has happened to me? Clearly this sinner is mortally wounded, for he vomits blood from the mouth." But considering the matter a little more closely, he perceived by the colour, taste, and smell that it was not blood, but the balsam from the flask which he had seen him drink, and was taken with such a loathing that his stomach turned, and he vomited up his insides over his very master, and both were left in a precious state. Sancho ran to his ass to get something wherewith to clean himself and relieve his master out of his alforjas, but not finding them, he well nigh took leave of his senses, and cursed himself anew, and in his heart resolved to quit his master and return home, even though he forfeited the wages of his service and all hopes of the promised land. Don Quixote now rose, and putting his left hand to his mouth to keep his teeth from falling out altogether, with the other he laid hold of the bridle of Rocinante, who had never stirred from his master's side. So loyal and well behaved was he, and betook himself to where the squire stood leaning over his ass with his hand to his cheek like one in deep dejection. Seeing him in this mood, looking so sad, Don Quixote said to him, "Bear in mind, Sancho, that one man is no more than another, unless he does more than another. All these tempests that fall upon us are signs that fair weather is coming shortly, and that things will go well with us, for it is impossible for good or evil to last for ever, and hence it follows that the evil having lasted long, the good must be now nigh at hand. So thou must not distress thyself at the misfortunes which happen to me, since thou hast no share in them." "How have I not?" replied Sancho. "Was he whom they blanketed yesterday perchance any other than my father's son? And the alforjas that are missing today with all my treasures, did they belong to any other but myself?" "What? Are the alforjas missing, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "Yes, they are missing," answered Sancho. "In that case we have nothing to eat today," replied Don Quixote. "It would be so," answered Sancho, "if there were none of the herbs your worship says you know in these meadows, those with which knights-errant, as unlucky as your worship, are wont to supply such like shortcomings." "For all that," answered Don Quixote, "I would rather have just now a quarter of bread, or a loaf and a couple of pilchards' heads, than all the herbs described by Dioscorides, even with Dr. Laguna's notes. Nevertheless, Sancho the Good, mount thy beast and come along with me, for God, who provides for all things, will not fail us, more especially when we are so active in his service as we are, since he fails not the midges of the air, nor the grubs of the earth, nor the tadpoles of the water, and is so merciful that he maketh his sun to rise on the good and on the evil, and sendeth rain on the unjust and on the just." "Your worship would make a better preacher than a knight-errant," said Sancho. "Knights-errant knew and ought to know everything, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for there were knights-errant in former times as well qualified to deliver a sermon or discourse in the middle of the encampment as if they had graduated in the University of Paris, whereby we may see that the lance has never blunted the pen, nor the pen the lance." "Well, be it as your worship says," replied Sancho. "Let us be off now, and find some place of shelter for the night, and God grant it may be somewhere where there are no blankets, nor blanketeers, nor phantoms, nor enchanted Moors, for if there are, may the devil take the whole concern. Ask that of God, my son, said Don Quixote, and do thou lead on where thou wilt. For this time I leave our lodgings to thy choice, but reach me here thy hand, and feel with thy finger, and find out how many of my teeth and grinders are missing from this right side of the upper jaw, for it is there I feel the pain. Sancho put in his fingers, and feeling about asked him, How many grinders used your worship have on this side? 4, replied Don Quixote, besides the back tooth, all whole and quite sound. Mind what you are saying, señor. I say 4, if not 5, answered Don Quixote, for never in my life have I had tooth or grinder drawn, nor has any fallen out or been destroyed by any decay or rheum. Well then, said Sancho, in this lower side your worship has no more than 2 grinders and a half. In the upper neither a half nor any at all, for it is as smooth as the palm of my hand. Luckless that I am, said Don Quixote, hearing the sad news his squire gave him. I had rather they despoiled me of an arm, so it were not the sword arm. For I tell thee, Sancho, a mouth without teeth is like a mill without a millstone, and a tooth is much more to be prized than a diamond. But we who profess the austere order of chivalry are liable to all this. Mount, friend, and lead the way, and I will follow thee at whatever pace thou wilt. Sancho did as he bade him, and proceeded in the direction in which he thought he might find refuge without quitting the high road, which was there very much frequented. As they went along then, at a slow pace, for the pain in Don Quixote's jaws kept him uneasy and ill-disposed for speed, Sancho thought it well to amuse and divert him by talk of some kind, and among the things he said to him was that which will be told in the following chapter. End of chapter 18.